Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. We'll begin the second half of the second session, and this time we have Dr. Sayyida Rosanna Rashid, who will be talking to us on the First World War, implications of labor migration between and from colonies, the case of the Indian subcontinent. Dr. Rashid teaches international relations at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh, and she most probably needs no introduction to most of you sitting over here. However, for the benefit of those of us who are from outside, she was educated in Dhaka, Oxford, and Sussex, and obtained her PhD in migration studies from the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. And her research areas include forced and voluntary migration, gender and social protection, and livelihoods. And she has published a number of books, modules, and journal articles at home and abroad. In her paper, Dr. Rashid is going to be talking about the general dearth of research that is connected with the impact of the First World War on labor migration, the nature, trend, and magnitude of this, as well as the effect on the lives and livelihoods of these migrant workers brought about by the First World War. In the military context, the role of the Indian subcontinent in providing non-combatant military labor is one of the most, I mean, if the combatant role or the role of combatant soldiers from the subcontinent is unknown, then the role of these non-combatant laborers in the First World War is not it's not visible at all on the horizon. There's almost no mention of it at all. I do have a colleague back in Delhi at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she's been doing some excellent work on the Indian Labor Corps in the First World War. And I will just, to put things in perspective, of the 1.4 million Indians that served abroad, about nearly 600,000 of them were non-combatant laborers and porters that served in various theaters of war, and without whose participation, in some cases, the conduct of operations would have been very, very different from what actually transpired. And this particular aspect, I was talking to Dr. Rashid during lunch, and she is going to touch upon it, although I think her paper has a wider overreach in terms of labor migration as a whole. But coming back to the military labor, these people were included in the Indian Labor Corps, in Porter Corps, and they were with medical units, transport units, ordnance units. They were attached to infantry and cavalry units, and they were subject to the Indian Army Act. Although it has been, I think, statistically, the Egyptian Labor Corps was larger than the Indian contingent, but in the official colonial records, everywhere the cry was for Indian labor. They said that they're any day better than the Egyptians, who are useless, and that's what most of the reports kept coming back from. So without any further ado, I'd hand you over to Dr. Rashid. Look forward to hearing your paper now.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my voice. I've almost lost my voice yesterday. Today, I hope I'll be able to present somehow. First, I must express my gratitude to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present a paper in such a memorable international event. I really feel proud and fortunate to be part of these gala events. And today, I'll basically present a paper on First World War implications of labor mobility within and between colonies. Migration being my primary area of interest, I was actually thinking what implications does it hold as far as First World War and the colonies are concerned. The conventional knowledge suggests that colonial migration fell sharply during and after the First World War, and, depression halted the globalization trend, coupled with the demise of European empire and violent conflict between indentured and indigenous ethnic groups. Alternatively, there are scholars who suggest that the demand for colonial labor did not cease to exist with the war, since the colonies were one of the major suppliers of agricultural and mineral products for war economies. Scholars also highlight the increased demand of colonized people in the colonial armed forces at combatant and non-combatant forces. So, although there are controversies about what is conventional, what is alternative, but this is the context within which I will try to actually look into the First World War implications of labor movement from and within colonies. In doing so, I will shed lights on the nature and scope of labor flows between imperial powers and the colonies, the qualitative and quantitative changes that occur in the flow, the causes and consequences of such demand, and finally, I will try to shed some light on how these whole findings may be relevant to the present-day condition of labor movement, from Asia, Africa, Asia to other parts of the world. And in writing this paper, I was dependent on secondary sources, since it's a historical kind of thing. Now, while both migration and colonial studies have already established themselves as specialized areas of scholarly interest, I was kind of inclined to know how each of them can inform each other, like migration and colonial studies. It is expected that such an analysis would offer a new insight into the understanding the ways in which relations between colonial power and colonies were actually mediated by the First World War. So the rationality of the paper also lies in revisiting the theories of migration. Actually, at the end, I will just try to touch upon the theories of migration and the colonial expansion, and just like to see how my findings go with these theories, or we should think some other way of explaining this. It is not possible to focus on all the colonies within such a short span of time, so I have selected Indian subcontinent just to take an overview of what was happening in terms of labor migration during First World War. Now, what was the character of migration during First World War? I observed two distinct type of migration from colonies during First World War. The first one was, as usual, labor migration from one colony to another, and the second one was kind of military migration. Again, the military migration was divided in two types of labor. The first one is troops who served as combatant in the war, and the second who served as non-combatant labor corps. First, I will focus on indentured labor from colonized India. Asia offered, as you know, a large supply of low-cost, unskilled labor, but even with the cost of international migration lower in the 19th century, than in earlier centuries, Asian laborers were too poor to finance the move. We know the 16th and 17th century was the era of slave trade. And with the abolition of slave trade in 1834 in England, they had to look for different alternative sources of labor. And many of the indentured, this is how the indentured laborer came into being. They were too poor to finance themselves, so it is actually the laborer actually sourced in India. They were paid for coming to the other colonies, and it was typically The contracts were typically from 5 to 7 years duration. And scholars report that there are 80 years of formal indentured servant system, like from 1830 to 1916. Almost 2 million Indians were transported overseas to further the British goal of empire building, and indentured labor were recruited to work in sugar, cotton, tea plantations, rail constructions in various British colonies in West Indies, Africa, Southeast Asia. Many of them were physically moved into the slave barracks, although they are said to be indentured labor, much better than slave, but the real condition was just like slaves. Is a new system of slavery, as one scholar Tinker has termed it. And they were not allowed to leave their workplaces. They had to live in the plantation area. They had to work for unlimited hours, were barred from taking any other employment, and in case of misconduct, subjected to financial penalty and physical punishment. The basic pay, free accommodation, food rations, and fully partially paid return passage to India, these are all incentives, but then this was kind of a new system of slavery. The procurement system is also very interesting. You can see the map. The purple color at the bottom, it actually shows how from India it is going to West Indies, South Africa, East Africa, and other colonies, even Malaya and other colonies of England. And a group of these laborers became dalals or middlemen in this process, and they were basically used to do the system of collection. They used to collect this paper from their villages, often by coerced means, often through through their consent. So this is something which where we see both force and voluntarism and freedom and coercion. Everything is working. It's a gray area. Most of the people employed in this way didn't know what is actually waiting for them there. But given the bad condition in the poor condition in their in India, they were actually forced. I'll give you some example why they have been motivated to migrate. Like at that time, I'm talking about a time which is after 1830 or 1850 to 1916, 17. The decline in Indian dominance in ocean shipping and industrial and commercial financial enterprise led to the loss of Indian entrepreneurial classes, and which had a trickle-down effect also. And land prices increased. There were growing poverty in India and no high standard of life, and productivity was very low in case of agricultural works, and natural calamity, disease, as well as riots, etc., were evident. In 1897, there were 17 million agri laborers in India, which increased in 1901 to 35 million, and in a decade later, it was 41 million. So you can imagine how this illiterate and poor class was the scope was increasing, their number was increasing. And in most cases, they were the low and outcast people. They had the double burden. Immigration was a viable means to escape. You can see a chart of how different countries actually accommodated this large number of indentured labor. 19 colonies actually have taken them, and Mauritius, 500,000 went to Mauritius, 500,000 to Caribbean islands, and a smaller number went to Fiji, Pacific Ocean, Natal in South Africa, East Africa. And the chart will give you a better idea. Okay, now what happened to this indentured labor? As we know, by 1917, uh, British abolished, British officially, Britain officially abolished indentured labor process. Um, However, in other areas, we see the, in other areas also, which were not part of British colonies, the changes in technology, unskilled labor in plantation agriculture, disruption in the world economy due to Great Depression, all this resulted in the, decline in the demand of this indentured labor. My second type of labor migration that I will focus on now is military migration. As Mr. Rana has already pointed out, a large number of Indians were actually taken to Europe and other theaters of war as combatant and non-combatant forces to fight during the First World War. The British Indian Army, officially named just the Indian Army, was an important part of British Empire's forces, both in India and abroad. Instead of fighting for their own sake, they worked for defense of both British India and princely estate. I think we have enough discussion on this, why they have fought and why they collaborated with the British, although they, at that time, kind of nationalism and other things are actually coming out. About 1.3 million men served in the First World War, many on the Western Front and later in the other front. We all know that some of the races in India had the reputation of martial race, like Sikhs. As motivation, we can think about many things, but it's written from different perspective. So when I was actually reading some Western literature, I found that religion, their loyalty to the king, and their responsibility, etc., actually motivated them to fight against, fight in the First World War. But obviously there were other political and economic imperatives. The number of troops. Yeah, the total number of Indian soldiers, 1.5 million around, deployed in Europe Western Front in 1914, 150,000. In the Middle East, there were 700,000 deployed, and later on, in 1918, 8,700 were recruited through conscription. The next one. Yeah, so you can see the Indian forces marching in France during the First World War. The next one. Yeah, they are fighting in Mesopotamia, actually, in the Middle East. So I've put these photos here just to show you the features and profile of these people. See, the picture itself speaks about how these people were, where they came from. The faces you can read. They are basically from the lower strata of the society. Okay, we'll discuss about it at the later part of the, my paper. Yeah, the second type of migrants who were taken to serve in the First World War were the non-combatant workers. The total number of workers I've given in the chart, it was like 389,000. The total number of war workers in 1918 was 700,000, and Indian war workers were like 21,000. But we have to remember that many of the Indians who were actually taken in Europe to fight, when they came back from the front line, they were actually recruited as non-combatant force, labor corps, because initially with the shortage of manpower for labor working continues, Sir Douglas Haig, they requested an increase in the force, an additional 21,000. And what was the purpose? Actually, why they were recruited? During the First World War, the British and French required extra labor for building and maintaining this huge network of roads, railways, canals, buildings, camps, stores, telegraph, telephone system, etc. And initially, like in 1914, they didn't have any kind of organized kind of thing, and it was done mostly by Army Service Corps, Royal Engineers, Labor Battalions, non-combatant corps. But later, in 1917, the Labor Corps were formed with some 389,000 men, and at a later stage, like in 1918, we see that they were recruiting Egyptian, Chinese, Indians to serve in this Labor Corps. Now the implications, the main part of my paper. Yeah. So, well, I was thinking, what is the implication of these two types of migration? We can think it from the point of view of political, economic implications, and then caste, class, gender implications was there, livelihood implications were there, and sociocultural implications were there. From political economic point of view, for colonial power, this was obviously an imperialist ambition. The way they employed these colonial people in the war, it has a political economy of imperialism. The war economy itself was actually boosted by the colonies. We know that the colonies supplied goods, and some of them also made financial contributions other than troops and labor. India, for instance, contributed 146 million pounds to the British war cost between 1914 to 1920, and they supplied the product of cotton, jute, paper, and wool. So, coming back to that point, the alternative thesis, which says actually that the purpose of labor, employing labor did not diminish with the war, is we find here that still there were demand for cotton, jute, and other industrial and agricultural products for which this labor was immensely, significantly important. In some cases, it was difficult to decide whether the colonies should be used primarily as a base for economic exploitation, or whether the focus should be laid on the recruitment of soldiers. Now, if we try to understand the class, caste, and gender implications, obviously, you know, the indentured labor, they were mostly taken from the lower strata of the society, and sometimes they from the lower caste among Hindus, they were and marginalized. So it's a double burden, triple burden. Like you were marginalized, you were poor, you were lower caste, and you were from the bottom strata of the society. So in terms of gender, we see more male migrated than female, and also the family reunification kind of thing was not there. A very small number of females were actually permitted to go to the plantation, or in terms of troops, it was, as I understood, it was basically the male who migrated. And the profile of the migrant was individual migrant, no family migration. Now the livelihood implications. Obviously, the first one, the indentured labor, had livelihood implications. Although the process was kind of, the deception was there, force was there, but it had an impact on the lives of the people, and also the people left behind in India. And a number of studies show that this kind of migration has a positive impact both at the sending and receiving end. And however, there is, you know, to understand the plight of the people who became incorporated, or who became integrated in the societies where they were taken for plantation. The bottom level people were still called as proletarian diaspora. Many of the people, after abolition of this indentured labor system, many of them came back to India, and many of them settled down. And you still find that a large number of Indians settle in Fiji, and you know, in other countries, in South Africa and Mauritius. So their descendants are there, and later on they found economic and social mobility. It was there. The sociocultural implication, of course, there were, when this indentured labor tried to settle down, there were ethnic problems with indigenous people. This is something that, that is highlighted in a large number of studies, so I'm not going in detail of this. There were other issues for the troops and non-combatant migrants. There were the issues of exposure to new culture. The other issues were the negative war imagery of the colonial soldiers. A number of scholars have worked on it, like how they were portrayed when they went to Europe and they fought against Germans. There were propaganda from both German sides and also from French sides, as I have noticed. And often they were used as positive war imagery when they were, especially Muslim troops were Muslim Indians were deployed in Mesopotamia or the Middle East. Now, what is the present day implication? That is interesting. You know, just take Bangladesh as a case, where from 80s to now, like from 76 to 2012, 13, 8.3 million migrated as short-term labor to the Middle East and other countries. And they were mostly going through middlemen, through social network, and when they are sending remittance, it is actually used for their social mobility, economic mobility. That is another topic which needs another paper. But here, if I want to link the whole thing with the present day context, I must mention it that the same system of exploitation, the same system of recruitment, and you know, the results, the consequence is still there. So in the uneven development, so if I take it to the wider, the broader context of international migration from developed and developing countries, then we see the uneven development is still there as it was existent in British colonial period during First World War. The forced labor conditions are still there. Just think about Bangladeshis working abroad. And the policies, the restrictive migration policies of the North, still we can think about it when we are talking about war, labor, the labor migration during First World War. And finally, I will just raise some theoretical kind of questions or implications. To what extent actually this wartime colonial migration can be termed as a natural consequence of capitalist expansion, or should it be understood as a product of division of labor, or as just an obvious element of capitalist labor relations, or international migration is just another manifestation of neocolonialism. So these are the theoretical thinking that came to my mind. There is enough scope to work on this later on, so I'll just stop here and leave it for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. I'd now like to call upon Professor Dr. Iftikhar Iqbal, who will be talking to us on the environmental impact of the First World War and the Afro-Asian experiences that can be gained from this study. He will be looking at the subject on two main issues. Firstly is the implication of the war on environmental awareness, and simultaneously the impact of the war on the physical environment of some selected regions of Asia and Africa, and especially in terms of forestry, water, and forestry and water. And he argues that the failure to deal with this environmental impact in World War I was to have a direct impact consequence in greater environmental disasters in the Second World War, and in which the colonial world takes a corresponding share of this. So over to Dr. Iqbal.
Thank you, sir. Honored Chair, my colleagues and dear students, welcome to this last over of today's innings. It must have been a very long day for those who have come in the morning. So thank you for bearing with us. My paper sits a bit uncomfortably with other papers because most of the papers in today and tomorrow are concerned with more or less political implications of the war, with a few exceptions. So I feel environment is probably is not that much sitting well with it. But I would like to argue that there was some very significant environmental impact of the World War. And as environmental history becomes an important branch of historical studies, we now know that the major wars are not just about strategy, death and destruction and weapons and diplomacy, but it is also about the way it affects natural environment. And in recent times, there have been excellent researches on the impact of the war on European war theaters, but there are also some researches are coming up in the past few years, which also talks about environmental impact of the war on non-Western world. Let me start with a poem titled July 1914 by a Russian poet, Anna Akhmatova. All months a smell of burning of dry peat, smoldering in the box. Even the birds have stopped singing. The aspen doesn't tremble. The god of wrath glares in the sky. The fields have been parched since Easter. A one-legged pilgrim stood in the yard with his mouth full of prophecies. Beware of terrible times. The earth opening for a crowd of corpses. Expect famine, earthquakes, plagues, and heavens darkened by eclipses. End of poem. This was exactly what happened in the next few years, not just in Europe, but in most parts of the world. I will give just a few examples, 3 or 4 examples of the specific ways in which the war had environmental impact, directly or indirectly. One of the strange warfare, we all know that the direct impact of the war on the environment, we know that dramatic landscape changes took place because of the trench warfare, and the digging of trenches caused trampling of grassland, of course, and crushing of plants and animals, and churning of soil. Erosion resulted from forest logging to expand the network of trenches, and soil structures are altered severely. And in fact, part of Europe's landscape changed forever. From trench warfare to chemical warfare, as we know that the damaging impact was the application of poison gas to kill soldiers of opposite front, of course. And examples of gases applied during the First World War was the tear gas, of course, aerosols causing eye irritation, and mustard gas, and chloride. And battlefields were polluted, and most of the gas, of course, evaporated into the atmosphere. And after the war, unexploded ammunition caused major problems in former battle area. By the war's end, chemical warfare produced about 1.3 million casualties, including more than 100,000 deaths, mostly caused by carbonyl chloride. And it is difficult to assess the immediate environmental impacts because there was not much data on it, but its carryover effect was massive. Chemical warfare increased the size of chemical industries, demonstrated the value of scientific research to chemists and governments, and helped inspire post-war pesticides, another environmental impact of the war. And it was not until the 1970s that the use of DDT was banned all over particularly in America, following the publication of the Silent Spring of Rachel Carson. Now, from there, I'd like to talk a little bit about influenza. As you know, millions of people died in the war, and immediately after the war, a majority were civilians. And those soldiers who came back with malaria, dysentery, tuberculosis, and sexually transmitted disease, typhoid, influenza, and other diseases that affected also the local people. And a great example of the war was of this war-related disease mortality is the so-called Spanish flu. And mass movement of troops and close quarter caused the Spanish flu to spread quickly. And while the war itself claimed an estimated 16 million deaths, the influenza epidemic that swept the world in 1918 killed an estimated 50 million people. So more people were killed in influenza than in the war itself. And 1/5 of the world's population was attacked by this deadly virus, and outbreaks swept across North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Brazil, and South Pacific. And in fact, India, in India, the mortality rate was extremely high at around 50 deaths from influenza per 1,000 people. And in India alone, more than 15 million people died, followed by 1.5 million deaths in Africa and Madagascar. And some scholars thought that the epidemic as a biological warfare tool was a biological warfare tool of Germany. And many also suggest that it was a result of the trench warfare, the use of mustard gases, and the generated smoke and fumes of the war. Now, a little bit on deforestation. Of course, there is huge implication, huge impact on the forestry. Just one example, after the Battle of Tannenberg in Poland in 1914, the Germans cleared 5% of the Lithuanian forest of Białowieża, formerly maintained as the Jars hunting grounds, and taking 5 million cubic meters of wood back to Germany. And also, India also saw a lot of deforestation during the war. So Indians were dying in many parts of the world, and so as Indian trees were being killed in home. Another example is coal mining. As probably the experts, military expert would know, the consumption of steel for military purposes by the Western European soldier in the First World War was about 2.5 tons per head in the field, in the battlefields. And steel, of course, means coal and iron. And just how India was affected by that, the example is that India produced 6.12 million tons per year by 1900. I'm talking about coal. And in 1920, it grew to about 18 million tons. And the production got a sudden boost from during the First World War. And what was the impact of coal mining on the Indian landscape is subject to further exploration. Now, from the global and regional scene, I would like to briefly turn to Bangladesh. It may sound a bit stretching of thought, but I would argue that there were environmental implications of the First World War for Bangladesh quite remarkably. And I will examine this issue from the example of a tiny weed called Kochuripana, water hyacinth. First, let's have a look at a few words about the extent of the problem in Bangladesh or Eastern Bengal. A conservative estimate revealed that in 1930s, the water hyacinth covered, or Kochuripana, covered about 5,000 square miles of water bodies and land, shabby land areas, wetlands. And during this period, the annual damage done by this weed in Bengal was estimated at more than 60 million rupees from the official records. And recent researches also suggest that the water hyacinth continued to create havoc in the region, leading to malaria, cholera, and diarrhea, particularly of both men and cattle. And crop failure due to water hyacinth is also considered to have contributed to the Great Bengal famine during the Second World War, which killed about 3 million people. Now, there is this theory that it was, I found that in the British archives, that the rapid spread of this weed in Bengal could be traced to the Germans, actually, who wanted to weaken the British, I quote and unquote, killing their Indian subjects. In fact, it has since been known as German Pana. Even in some rural areas, they are known as German Pana. And so if the German attempt to suffocate the waterways by German Pana is even a German attempt to suffocate the waterways of Bengal as even partially true, then this can be connected to the history of the First World War. But if we take this story for certain, we can also readily suggest that the war had direct impact on environment in Bangladesh, an impact that continued to be felt during the Second World War. And if we are to believe that the British officials, it was the Germans who were responsible for this. Now, a closer look actually at the problem will suggest that there might be another perspective at least. And this different perspective has to do with the fact that the British colonial state and a multinational company, Shaw Wallace, which is still in existence in Bangladesh, but it is not structurally connected to that, were very keen on promoting water hyacinth during the First World War. In the context of restricted access to potash because of the war, the Shaw Wallace company urged the government of Bengal to make it known, I quote, to agriculturists and those who can promote this scheme, effectively. The company suggested if the ash had reached them in good condition and was not adulterated, they were ready to pay between 85 to 120 rupees per ton. It's taking place during the wartime I'm referring to. And accordingly, the government of Bengal started researches on the way to produce the best kind of water hyacinth. After conducting experiments in the Dhaka agricultural farm in 1916, the government officials suggested that apart from high potash content, the water hyacinth is at least as rich as farmyard manure in terms of both nitrogen and phosphoric acid. In a more specific analysis, the colonial experts cum bureaucrats found that the nitrogen content of the dry material was as high as more than 2%, and in the damp state, which contains more than 60% of water, and it was only, the experts, what was they suggesting, that the rotting process involved a loss of about 70% of the available potash and 60% of nitrogen out of the water hyacinth. And in other words, the key finding of the research was that the burning of water hyacinth to ash was much better than rotting it in terms of nutrient value. The Shaw Wallace company was not satisfied by the quality of the hyacinth supplied in the early phases of the transaction, that is, early phases of the war itself. And in 1918, the company directors informed the government of India, not government of Bengal, but they are reaching out to the government of India, that in future they would not buy any ash containing less than 15% of potash. Consequently, the government of India advised the people to cultivate water hyacinth very properly and methodically. So, I would not talk much about this. I'd like to conclude by referring to Kazi Nazrul Islam. It is rightly suggested that the First World War had a great formative contribution in raising nationalist aspirations, sentiments, and anti-colonial political awareness. Kazi Nazrul Islam is one of the great examples of such political awareness. And this is also suggested on many occasions, and especially in a paper coming up next tomorrow on Nazrul Islam. But it may just be added here that as in the years after his return, Nazrul started resisting colonial regime, he also found himself energized enough to write against the water hyacinth, which was the environmental legacy of the First World War. In other words, Nazrul returned from the war front with political impetus for freedom, but he also had to fight against some environmental problems left over by the war. I'm saying this on the strength of a poem written by Nazrul probably in the late 1920s, and I conclude the, I would like to read the Bengali one first, very briefly. I will take only 2 or 3 more minutes. It is by Nazrul Islam. He is writing, Dhangsho koro ei kochuri pana, era lata noy, porodeshi অসুর ছানা, ইহাদের সবংশে করো করো নাশ, এদের দগ্ধ করে করো ছাই পাশ। এরা জীবনের দুশ্মন গলার ফাঁস, এরা দত্তের দাঁত রাক্ষসের ডানা, ধ্বংস করো এই কচুরিপানা। এরা ম্যালেরিয়া আনে আনে অভাব নরক, এরা অমঙ্গলের দূত ভীষণ মরক। এরা একে একে গ্রাস করে নদী ও নালা, যত বিল ঝিল মাঠঘাট ডোবা ও খানা, ধ্বংস করো এই কচুরিপানা। এরা বাংলার অভিশাপ বিষ পাপ, এসো সমূলে কচুরিপানা করে ফেলি সাফ। এরা শ্যামল বাংলাদেশ করিল শ্মশান, এরা শয়তানি দূত দুর্ভিক্ষ আনা, ধ্বংস করো এই কচুরিপানা। কাল সাপের ফনা এদের পাতায় পাতায়, এরা রক্ত বীজের ঝাড় মরিতে না চায়। ভাই এরা না মরিলে মোরা মরিব সবাই, এরে নির্মূল করে ফেলো শুনো না মানা, ধ্বংস করো এই কচুরিপানা। Now, for those non-English speaking, I'd like to just non-Bengali speaking, anyway, those who are not reading Nazrul in its original spirit and Nazrul's poem is, of course, is beyond anyone's reach, anyone's translation prowess. But this is a kind of very rough translation. Destroy this water hyacinth. They are not plants, but children of foreign devils. Destroy them in full. Put them on fire and burn them to ashes. They are the enemy of life and a strangler. They are the teeth of a monster, the wings of cannibal. Destroy this water hyacinth. They are the agents of malaria, famine, and the hell. They are the harbinger of bad luck and devastating plague. One by one, they swallow rivers and canals, rivulets, streams, ponds, fields, and drains. Destroy this water hyacinth. They are the curse of Bengal, poisonous sin. Let's clear them from the roots. They have turned the green Bengal into graveyard. They are the devil's ambassador. Destroy this water hyacinth. Hoods of black snakes peep through their leaves. They are the endless breeds of goblins who live forever. Brothers, if they don't die, we all die. Eliminate them, please don't listen otherwise. Destroy this water hyacinth. So this is where I'd like to depart. I will just stop here with note that the perception that there was not much environmental impact of the First World War on the colonized and non-European war theaters, areas where the war didn't actually take place. Actually, the war indeed led to many political and social issues, but it also ushered in huge ecological problems in places even where the war didn't take place. And secondly, the legacy of the war, which is also particularly important to emphasize, that the legacy of the war was not merely political, but also it has non-political legacies. And talking about Qazi Nazrul Islam, I think that also connects to the poem we were referring to at the beginning of the talk about the Russian poem, that plague and all these things coming up. So it fits also well with Nazrul's environmental awareness. So if we want to look at this non-political, something that beyond nationalist debates around the First World War, there are many other debates were taking root. For example, these environmental debates, somewhere in Russia, also in Bengal. So that connected this world of imagination, the world of non-political discourses. So with that note, I'd like to end here. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Iqbal, for a very interesting talk, and I must apologize. I realize I hadn't read out your introduction, but I would take comfort in the fact that everybody in this audience would know you. My sincere apologies for my lapse. Talking about the effect of war on environment, just a very brief aside. I, in a former life, was serving in the Indian Air Force. And I remember the year that the Gulf War ended and the oil fields were set fire in Iraq, in Kuwait actually. The snow that fell in the Srinagar Valley in the north, in Sonmarg, was black. So that is the effect of pollution caused by war across the Persian Gulf in a country as far afield as India. We've come to the end of our speakers' talks. We've had an extremely illuminating session. Must thank all of our speakers. But before, of course, we end, I'd like to throw the floor open for questions and answers, and to give the speakers a chance to respond. Sir.
Well, 2 points, one to Philip and one to Rosanna. Philip, here I am. Right. I just wanted to know, is it because, you have almost, the timing is almost simultaneous, the Irish Republican armies or, the Irish movement, and when Gandhi was, campaigning and coming with a non-violent, this non-violence thing. Is it because, the Northern Ireland is still stuck because there is not much of Gandhian kind of movement there, save in 80s, I think it's Bobby Sands in 1981, when he does what Gandhi used to do all the time, hunger strike. That's one has been very critical. Even after 1947, he went for hunger strikes several times to stop the riots. Now here is Bobby Sands coming out of, a revolutionary kind of a movement, then settling down for a very non-violent kind of a thing. The misfortune was you had Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, and but I still remember in those times Bobby Sands, ended up being a hero after a kind of a martyr, and from Iran to Cuba, even Australia, you have monuments in the name of Bobby Sands. So I was thinking, is it because as I was trying to point out in my presentation, that if you take up your enemy's instruments, then for the enemy it becomes very easy. Is there something, less of Gandhi in Ireland is an issue, and even Bobby Sands couldn't take it further? That would be a kind of a query. Where is non-violence in this Northern Ireland movement as it stands today? With Rosanna, my a quick one would be, what about the peacekeeping, international peacekeeping, where Bangladesh is number one? Here is Bangladesh sending troops everywhere in the world, much more in a bigger way than we did in First World War. How do you place that? Is that part of, well, there are critics who would say that it's cheaper. Is it something that is continuing? In fact, what is with this peacekeeping that we have, and how do you look that in the context of now that we have a post-colonial structure altogether, or is it something which is a continuing thing?
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chair. I have two comments on Dr. Samuel Barth's paper. The number one is, he mentioned about partition of Bengal and the French support to the nationalist movement in India. But he, however, didn't mention that the majority population of East Bengal was in support of the partition of Bengal. It was the Babus of Calcutta who were opposing the partition of Bengal in 1905. And number two is, the French were supporting Indian nationalist movement, but at the same time, the Algerian nationalist movements were being suppressed. So basically, it was no love for the Indian nationalists that the French gave support. or whatever they did at that time. It was basically a crude imperialist policy of the French rulers, and it has nothing to do with any policy support for the independence movement. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Hello. I am a student of English department, University of Dhaka, third year. Okay, thank you. I'm from CST, Chittagong Hill Tracts, very southern and east area of Bangladesh. But my question is here, and the topic is war and colonies. And in the CST, if anybody concerned on the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, then the area very, I want to say that I am not served as a human being in society, but I am served as a very tribe and what I can say a minority of Bangladesh, minority people of Bangladesh. That is my question is that as the French Revolution has occurred, or revolution has occurred very many years ago and hundreds years ago, but that the motto was the fraternity, liberty, and equality. And we have passed very human development. Humanity is developed, but why the absolutely I want to say that the heinous war crimes also and colonies characters also is happening on the occasion of CST, that is the southern east parts of Bangladesh. Many heinous war crimes also happen. Such like, if I want to say that such kind of very rape after killing, or rape after killing, and that's also such kind of, and without justice, killing without justice also happening yet now. That's what my question is that what is the relation between colonialism and the human development? My question is there. Thank you.
Since this morning we had some wonderful discussions on the issue of this, the aftermath of the First World War. So my question is, would you like to confront this by political debates and political process instead of confronting it by philosophical way? That is, would it not be necessary to bring new philosophy for human existence on earth instead of triggering hatred and war among the nations and arranging the meetings to solve it by different powers? Why should we not think for a universal philosophy which is mostly propagated from this soil by Mahatma Gandhi and Tagore? Second thing, would it not be necessary for today to make a massive campaign against war, as we are doing for ecological and environmental safety all over the world? Is it not that important for the global powers for them to make that campaign, like say no to war and say yes to peace? Or should we wait for another or more war all around the world, that there should be 5 world war again, and so that some of the people will die and that will be the end of the whole civilization? So that is another issue, and I don't think that some unity of the countries like European Union or Asian Bloc or other things could really solve this problem. One day there might be another emergence of power saying that yes, we are now Asia, so we will fight against Europe, and Europe say we are now Europe together, we will fight for another. So I think there is a fundamental need to confront this devil issue by new philosophy or the old philosophy, I don't know, but a philosophy for humanity. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you to the presenters for very insightful and diverse presentation. I've been here from the morning. I am
I'm sorry for just interrupting. I would just request everybody to, if you have a question specific to a speaker, please name the person that the question is directed towards. Otherwise, if it's just a general statement, then please, you know, make that clear as well. Thank you.
So my question is to whoever of the presenters can present at the panel. My question is particularly listening to all the presentation. Very intensive analysis of like the political initiatives that took during before the war, during the war, and aftermath. But I think there's a lack of analysis of what type of masculine processes that are still affecting warlike processes across. I would like to talk about South Asia. Especially, I see that the love for the hegemonic ways or controlling ways of through administrative or educational processes, like what I have seen, like in Bangladesh, countries like Bangladesh. Now, parents, like the administrators, they are lovers of the colonialist ways of, you know, ruling, you know, controlling this type of. So I think it is like, as my one of the like, we have to say no to war, but at the same time we have, how can we say no to all these inherent processes that we started loving? We started loving controlling others. We started loving hegemonizing others, but no, we are not talking about those things in such an important platform. I don't know whether I could make it clear, but we should equally be concerned about the other processes that are functioning underneath.
My question is to Professor Iqbal. I have been here till the first presentation went on, so I liked each and every one of them, but to me, born in the 20th, after the war is over for so long, I couldn't relate to most of them because they are like historical discourse in my mind, but I could relate to Monsieur Iqbal's presentation. I loved it. My question is, I have seen old videos of DDT being sprayed in public in America, but nowadays you wouldn't be able to find DDT in public, and every chemical compound would have a sticker behind its packet that it contains no DDT. So the FDA and FCN everywhere, DDT is not banned. But for water hyacinth, I have seen it, and I could relate to it, and I have seen it pollute a lot of, you know, water hose, brooks, and ponds. So I could relate to it. And my question is to Professor Iqbal is that what did we do to turn it around? To refrain housing from polluting our water. I heard and I read a thesis on furniture being made out of water hyacinths. So I liked it, but I mean, was it like arbitrary, I don't know, execution? Is it being used everywhere? Thank you.
I have a question. Here.
Do you have a question specific to what the panel has been talking about? All right, please.
Okay, at first I would like to start my question remembering Raja Raman Rai was the first recorded traveler to the overseas traveler, and it was happened after more than 50 years from the year of independence of America. So if you see the demography of Mauritius and some Caribbean islands, so here we and Fiji as well, we witnessed more than 10 to 40 or 50% are from India. So my question is, if it took place in 1828 and now First World War occurred in 1914, so when did the major fault took place? And another point is that, so most of the place of destination of the migration is the ex-British colonies, except two. One is Maurice, and second, Colonies. So this is the French colony and French overseas territory. So if it were that, who was behind the migration to French colonies? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll allow the speakers to respond to some of the specific questions. But before they do that, I think I'd just make a quick point about some of the points that were raised. I think they're more, well, they're statements rather than questions. And while, you know, I think we can talk about those, but really speaking, this is not the forum to do that, because the speakers are here to present papers on a particular specific topic. It's not a general debate on politics or on international relations or even on human rights and so on and so forth. So I would now request perhaps, ma'am, would you like to respond to the question?
Sir asked me about peacekeeping. Thank you very much for pointing out this thing, because I think I missed this point, especially if I try to see any relevance with the, wartime migration and current type of migration we see in Bangladesh. If you kind of analyze or try to find any parallel between peacekeeping and wartime troop migration, then I must say the motivations, process of recruitment, and consequences of the results they are gaining is totally different. What the troops got from their migration and what the current day peacekeepers, Bangladeshi peacekeepers, are gaining from it. That is one thing. Secondly, if we analyze it from the point of view of international politics, again we see there are a lot of differences, no commonalities. There are some commonalities. The common thing is that earlier also these colonies were actually exploited and used by the colonial powers for their own interest. The colonial troops are in indentured kind of labor. And here also, in the practice of UN or the presence of United Nations itself is problematic. As we see the permanent 5 members in the Security Council, they are the main decision makers. And again, this kind of peacekeeping, peace building kind of things are actually is kept for the smaller countries where they can contribute and can be benefited from, this type of thing. The debate is already there. Why the smaller countries, the smaller powers or developing countries are more participating in peacekeeping kind of thing, where their power cannot be exercised in like the UN Security Council. So although they are economically gaining from peacekeeping, the power politics says that they are still, with the inequality in terms of power and position is there. So you find some kind of commonality. Thank you.
Sir?
When I was, even if you take World War I, not all were volunteers. You had troops, Indian troops, serving, the British Empire. So the situation is not different. I mean, it's not all were volunteers, that they were recruited in a bad way. Some were trained, fully trained military officers. So, how do you see the colonial and the post-colonial kind of exercise that is still going on?
They are not all of them were not recruited through conscription or in a quest means, but still I see peacekeeping is much more kind of the voluntarism is there, the willingness is there. It's a good way of participation in the international kind of arena. But again, I would say that there are certain kind of power position is there. Okay.
Sir?
Thank you. I think there was a question on what has been directed to me, right? I'm afraid because of the sound quality, I didn't get a sense of it, but let me try. I think probably you're trying to refer to the connectivity between what has been and war or something. Oh, okay. But in a way, if you take the case of water hyacinth particularly, we don't need to worry anymore because we have killed all our water bodies already. So water hyacinth is not coming back anyway. But if any other, impact of warfare, it's everybody we are concerned. And I think by 1920s there was some convention about banning chemical, but we have seen chemical has been used in anywhere, many places in Iraq, even in Syria, and so these are still continuing. And how to contain that, it depends actually on the political will of those who rules the world, right? So I think there are a number of treaties, but when a conflict starts somewhere, there's hardly any. Yeah, thank you.
Samuel would like to ask you a question.
Yeah, Iqbal, thank you very much for your fantastic paper, but it was really enlightening, and you raised crucial issues. My only question was, why do you distinguish environmental issues and studies from political studies? I think they are politics and of environment, and it has, the two domains are absolutely interwoven. And I think environmental issues are even really crucial to politics, whether it comes to natural resources, to land system, to financial constraints, and to social, the impact on livelihood and all the social consequences of the politics of environment. I think it's pretty much at the heart of actually the politics of war. And we know that most of the war nowadays are actually aimed at controlling natural resources, whether it's water, oil, or many other natural resources.
Absolutely right. I was not trying to establish a distinction between political realm and natural realm. The water hyacinth itself was at the center of politics in Bengal. Like there was a water hyacinth week during the time of Sohrawardi, and he announced reward for he said that this eradication of water hyacinth will also lead to the kind of communal harmony among the Hindus and Muslims and all these things. What I'm trying is to say that in terms of the disciplinary scopes in Bangladesh, that we are and also that we are living in at a time when actually nationalism is being severely contested, and it has been rightly so since Rabindranath Tagore's time, as Imtiaz Sir was suggesting. But then in this whole pattern of debates, politics remains central. So I think you are right, we can connect these political debates with environmental debates. But since there is no place of that at all, so I was probably sounding a bit pushy about it, but I think you are also right that this is not disconnected, and I don't disagree to that. Thank you.
Once again, I apologize. I found it a little bit difficult just to hear sometimes what was being said. And if what I say over the next 2 or 3 minutes doesn't apply to your question, please come and talk to me at the end if we want to chat about that. There are several things here, right? First of all, I think down through the course of Irish history, I, as an Irishman, see examples of the very things we're talking here about. For example, the Great Irish Famine of the late 1840s is a classic example of the death of 1 million people and a subsequent trail of emigration afterwards of, first of all, ecological and political reasons why that famine takes place. There's a monoculture, i.e. the potato, which is the only thing people are eating. You have a government in London that doesn't have the knowledge or the care on the ground to deal with that monoculture and replace it with something healthier and many other things. There is also an environmental impact of that famine
in terms of the disappearance of a whole swathe of the population, which was Irish-speaking, for example, and lived in the west of Ireland, leaving the west of Ireland, a place that looks very romantic today, and people who go to Ireland tell me how much they like the look of it, but it's an empty place. Well, that's changing in recent times, thank God, in many, many ways. But, you know, there was an environmental impact there in terms of the landscape. And that leads on to talk about migration as well, because, of course, then what happened was the migration of many hundreds of thousands of people over the next few decades. What was perhaps fortunate about the migration was that much of it was to the United States, and that, of course, wasn't all a story of success, but because of the fact that the Irish were perceived as white, for example, gave them some kind of advantage in, though there were disadvantages too, of course, but advantage in America, the land of what was perceived to be at least the land, and for many people was the land of opportunity. But I mean, the specifics of migration and its damage are to do with things like gender. So, for example, there was a disproportionate number of the migrants would have been male, young men, leaving behind women. In many cases. I mean, Brian Friel, the great Irish playwright, in his play Dancing at Lunasa, which I recommend to you, deals with this theme where there are 5 single women in a family in an isolated farmstead in the west of Ireland, you know, who are without, it seems, marriage opportunities or you know, fulfillment in that regard. So migration has its gender side and many other sides. There was a question coming from over here, I think, just maybe trying to peer behind some of the things we have been talking about. You know, some of the deeper issues about war that we perhaps haven't fully confronted. Well, for one of them, for example, that interests me greatly in the work I do, looking back at the Great War, is trying to think about, again, gender in this context. You know, it's a very male narrative, and the actors in the proceedings seem to be very male. What are the women's stories? What were the perceptions of who women were, you know, at the time? What are the children's stories? We never think about war enough from a children's point of view, you know. What are the ways in which the enemy gets othered? You know, what is the discourse that others the enemy all the time and thinks in those very binary and shall we say, you know, black and white terms. So some of that work is very important as we try to work through a look at history of war and a history of colonialism. The final thing I want to say is in response to your very interesting question about the role of non-violence or not, particularly in more recent times in the north of Ireland. And you cite the famous example of Bobby Sands, one of several hunger strikers who died on hunger strike back in the early 1980s. Personally, and there'd be quite a raft of opinion behind me, I don't see that as a pure non-violent activity. Because during that entire period when those hunger strikes were happening, it wasn't as if the IRA military campaign had been switched off. It wasn't. It was continuing in full spate during that period, and people were dying due to that military campaign. What I think happened was that the campaign came to an end, and I think the Republican leadership learnt from that campaign. And one of the things it learnt in the next few years was a sense of things running out of steam, that violence can only go so far without violent reaction, the things you were talking about earlier today. One example, may I say, of what I think was a non-violent activity that is more interesting to me than the hunger strike, or was what was known as the Peace People. And the Peace People was a very mass, you may know, it was a mass organization of men and women stimulated by a particular death, a particularly atrocious death in the Troubles. And that led to, you know, a very serious attempt to hold mass demonstrations and even to bring, in the case of one of the leaders called Kieran McKeown, a lot of the theories of Gandhi and others to bear on the Irish situation. Now, it didn't stop the Troubles at that time, but it laid a lot of seeds for the future. The final thing I want to say in that regard is, I think eventually when the ceasefires came, one particular key influence here was South Africa. And the influence of Mandela was huge. And I know that several of Republican, by Republican I mean men and women who would have been in the IRA and fighting the contemporary war against Britain, one of the big concepts, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but I think it's called Ubuntu. The concept of, that in order to further the development in your society and to bring conflict to some kind of a closure, you need to be able to identify with that other. You need to be able to work with that other and understand that other. And some of the more progressive people that I see at work in Northern Ireland today do exactly that. There are serious attempts to try to work with people whom would have been regarded as an enemy, understand the motivations, understand the psychology. And I think that comes very directly from the deep connections that were formed with the ANC in South Africa. Huge connections. And I think that South African connection, which of course connects in various streams as well to Gandhi and, as well, that is a very important influence in more recent times. And I hope that answers your point.
Thank you for your question. I would not really go for historical fiction, because I dealt with a very precise question, which was Indian nationalist movement related to the Indian community in France, whether in French colonial settlement or in French territory from the late 19th century till the end of the First World War. So I started my speech quoting Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, which clearly pointed how disappointed he was by French attitude, first of all. We cannot really talk about French suppressing nationalist movement at that time, because there are not yet any nationalist movements in the French colonial empire. That will come later on. Second, regarding the partition, I don't think we can talk about majority opinion, whether pro or against partition of that time, for the simple reason that there are no elections held. So it seems to be, so I would not go for, what is clearly historically assessed is that there is the Swadesh movement and the violent anti-British rule movement after the first attempt of partition, so much so that in 1911 the plan for partition is cancelled, and that the capital of the Raj is transferred from Kolkata to Delhi. So I would not really go into what's the majority opinion for or against partition, but there's been resistance, violent resistance, definitively, and even in East Bengal, if you read the archive of the British intelligence, there's been attacks in East Bengal against British authorities related to the decision of partition. So I'm not judging if it was supported by majority or not, but as a matter of fact, there's been violent resistance. Was it the fact of a small minority? Maybe, not limited only to Kolkata, that is for sure, or not, so it's another question. There are some British historians, very not revolutionaries at all, who themselves claim that, well, it was meant at weakening the Indian nationalist movement, and so, but that is of course open to discussions. I've not said also that France was supportive to Indian nationalist movement. I think maybe I didn't speak clearly enough. I said that there have been instances on 2 occasions in the French daily Le Temps, giving echo to those to these violent actions against the British as part of the Swadesh movement. And I think Swadesh movement, we cannot really deny that there's been a Swadesh movement. As a whole, French government has not been solidar at all to the Indian nationalist movement. At best, it has been tolerant, at best, and most of the time, as I have actually shown in the paper, it has collaborated with the British authorities, because definitively French was a colonial power. I think it was quite clear enough in my paper. And as a colonial power, it felt itself threatened by other nationalist movements. But your point is very interesting, because it is also pointing some complex aspect of nationalist movement. Nationalist movement were not always anti-colonial movement before the First World War. The fact that Indian nationalists saw in France a possible platform or a possible alliance is revealing, since France was definitively a colonial power. Of course, this sympathy towards France was due to the French Revolution legacy, France not being a major colonial power in India. But again, we should not go for too much anachronism. The nationalist movement was, before to become anti-colonial, was more supported by a wish to get a more equal share into the governing, the ruling of the country. It turned anti-colonial and took a global anti-colonial dimension much more later on, which is not yet the case before and even during the First World War. That's more the British who want at that time to give a global dimension to the Indian nationalist movement and Egyptian nationalist movement. And a last point is that that's even, of course, that's again open to discussions and questions, but there've been, well, one quotation which I didn't have time to do, but which is very, very interesting, where a British talked to the French about impious alliance between pan-Islamism and Hindu revival. But at that time, the religion dimension to the nationalist movement is not there. Those are the British who project a religious dimension to the nationalist movement. The religious dimension is going to come later on, and I think it is quite interesting to make this point. So I think it's just maybe a matter of years. Situation change over a few years, over a few decades, and it seems to me very important to be precise about the content, the changes, the evolutions of those nationalist movement, anti-colonial movement, and the impact that the First World War had on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. And I'll just make a couple of very, very quick points. One was Dr. Rashid mentioned conscription. I'd just like to point out that in a military... Migration, sorry. Oh, sorry.
And sorry, I forgot about the migration in the French colonies. There have been recruitment. There were 5 French settlements in India, which I named, Chandanagar, Karikal, Pondicherry, Yanao, and Mahé, and they recruited indentured labor for the French colonies, whether in, in Reunion Island, in the French West Indies, in Guyana, and all the French colonies. So that's why you have sizable Indian communities in the French colonies as well.
Thank you. So I was just mentioning that in military terms, purely military terms, when we talk of conscription, there is an element of, you don't have a choice. It's something that is mandated by the authorities, by government. But in India, there was no conscription per se. It was all ostensibly, at least on paper, an all-volunteer force. But as we had discussed over lunch, there was definitely, as the war progressed from 1917 onwards, in certain areas, there was perhaps an element of coercion that is definite. But if we say conscription, then that's actually being inaccurate. Just thought I'd point that out. The point which Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed made about peacekeeping, I think that's very relevant. It is actually interesting. It's not germane to the present topic, but since he brought it up, that the 3 main nations of the world today that contribute peacekeepers, number 1, top of the list is Bangladesh, number 2, and number 3, it keeps changing between India and Pakistan. So I think there's something over there that perhaps needs to be examined, and his point about military labor and relationships is interesting. We spoke, yes, I mean, definitely, of course, I think it's an established that environment and security, there is, there's a huge, huge discourse today in environmental security, and the wars of the future are essentially going to be water wars and so on and so forth. And lastly, the point that Philip made about narratives and gender on World War I, it is of interest that the Punjab, which provided a very, very significant proportion of the Indian troops that fought in that war, the folk songs that are generated from that conflict to a very, very large extent, I think an overwhelming majority of them are a female narrative, and they are songs of longing, they are songs of separation, they are songs of dispossession and of loss. So, and they are songs of desire. So that's interesting in the sense that although there is an overwhelming male participation, but in the rural communities where these soldiers came from, the expression of that conflict lives on in the voices of the women that they left behind. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had an extremely interesting afternoon session, and I just is left for me on behalf of all of you to thank the speakers, and I think if you will please join me in showing your appreciation for all the hard work that they've put together and the knowledge they've brought to this forum. Thank you very much, everybody.
Just to tell that tomorrow, at the end of the last session, there will be a film shown on the different way the World War I has impacted the memories of the communities who have participated into the World War I.